The history of modern espionage is often chronicled through the cold lenses of high-resolution satellites, devastating cyber attacks, and silent drones that traverse the skies unseen. Yet, there exists a domain of shadow warfare that remains untouched by time. The exploitation of the inherent biological fragility of the human being. The Mossad, Israel's legendary intelligence and special operations service, masters a profound psychological technique that dictates that no man, regardless of how heavily he is surrounded by armed guards, concrete walls, or layers of state-of-the-art encryption, is ever truly invulnerable when his own body begins to betray him. The moment a powerful leader lies down on a hospital gurney, he ceases to be a commander and becomes an object. He surrenders control over the very air he breathes, the potent medications entering his veins, and the complex machines that rhythmically monitor the pace of his heart. This is the meticulously detailed chronicle of one of the most sophisticated operations of the 21st century, a plan that transformed the elite medical infrastructure of Qatar into a tool of surgical execution. To understand how the Mossad achieved the impossible, we must first look at the man they referred to as Khalid Al-Mansour. In the dark corners of the Middle East, Al-Mansour was both a living urban legend and a logistical nightmare for Western intelligence. He was not the face that appeared on colorful propaganda posters, nor the voice shouting rhetoric from a podium. Instead, Al-Mansour was the cerebral engine that made the propaganda possible. Educated in systems engineering at a prestigious European university under a false identity in the late 1990s, he returned to the region to become the primary link between Iranian funding and the advanced arsenals of militant groups in Beirut, Damascus, and Gaza. Al-Mansour was a master of clandestine routes and gray zone logistics. He possessed the rare knowledge of how to move tons of precision electronic components across 3 continents without a single crate being pried open by a curious customs official. He was a man who could transform industrial scrap and dual-use technology into high-precision gyroscopes for long-range missiles. His personal security protocols were obsessive, bordering on the pathological. He never slept in the same location for 2 consecutive nights. He utilized military-grade satellite phones with rolling encryption keys and never permitted anyone, except for his small, trusted Praetorian guard, to step within 10 meters of his person. He firmly believed that by living as a digital and physical ghost, he had outplayed the Mossad in the ultimate game of patience and survival. However, biology is the only system that Khalid Al-Mansour could not reprogram or encrypt. Decades of living in damp, lightless bunkers, the relentless stress of being the most wanted man in the Levant, and a genetic predisposition he had ignored for years began to exact a heavy toll. The Mossad, through its signals intelligence giant, Unit 8200, was not merely listening to his encrypted conversations. They were mining the digital waste of private medical clinics across the Middle East, searching for any flicker of physical weakness. In mid-2021, they found the opening they had sought for years, an encrypted appointment request for a world-renowned cardiologist, discussing a mitral valve in total collapse. Khalid Al-Mansour was dying, not because of an assassin's bullet or a drone strike, but because of a heart that could no longer sustain the crushing weight of his secrets and his sins. Israeli intelligence knew that Al-Mansour would never seek treatment in a country where Israel held direct influence or where Western extradition treaties were strong. He required a location that combined absolute diplomatic neutrality, extravagant luxury, and cutting-edge medical technology that could guarantee his survival without exposing him to his enemies. The chosen destination was the Al-Zubarah Medical Suite in Doha. Qatar, a nation that has mastered the delicate art of speaking to all sides of a conflict simultaneously, offered Khalid what he believed to be a golden sanctuary. He believed that within the reinforced glass walls of one of the most expensive clinics in the world, protected by the sacred laws of Arab hospitality and the pervasive vigilance of the Qatari intelligence service, he would be untouchable. He imagined that the Mossad would never risk a massive international diplomatic incident inside a high-profile hospital in Doha. Khalid Al-Mansour committed the fatal error of believing that the Mossad would follow the polite rules of international diplomacy when they had already decided to follow the cold, clinical laws of tactical medicine. While Khalid was packing his bags for Doha, in a classified facility deep within the Negev Desert, the Mossad was already building a perfect physical and digital simulacrum of the very hospital room where he would spend his final hours. The second phase of the operation, codenamed Clinical Shadow, required a level of logistical deception that bordered on the impossible. The Mossad strategists knew that they could not simply infiltrate the Al-Zubarah clinic with a team of armed commandos. The risk of an international scandal and a firefight in the heart of Doha was unacceptable. Instead, they decided to weaponize the very supply chain that kept the hospital at the cutting edge of medical science. The plan was to target the high-tech heart of the facility, its surgical robotics and patient monitoring infrastructure. In early 2021, Mossad's Economic Warfare Division, working in tandem with the technical specialists of Unit 81, established a sophisticated front company in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. They called it LuxMed Systems. This was not just a shell company on a piece of paper. It was a fully functioning entity with a professional website, a physical office in a high-end business district, and a staff of unwitting European employees who believed they were working for a rising star in the medical logistics industry. LuxMed Systems spent months building a reputation by facilitating the sale of high-end diagnostic equipment to various hospitals across the Middle East. They were patient, waiting for the specific moment when the Al-Zubarah clinic would need to upgrade its robotic surgery suite to accommodate a high-priority patient like Khalid Al-Mansour. When the hospital's procurement department eventually reached out to authorized European distributors for the latest German-engineered robotic arms and cardiac monitoring stations, LuxMed Systems was positioned to offer a deal that was too attractive to ignore. Through a series of shadow subsidies and backroom negotiations with the original manufacturers in Munich, the Mossad ensured that LuxMed became the primary logistics partner for the delivery, installation, and initial calibration of the equipment destined for Qatar. The most critical moment of the operation occurred in a secure, climate-controlled warehouse near the port of Rotterdam. The massive crates containing the surgical robotics, worth millions of dollars, were diverted into a private bay under the pretext of a final quality assurance inspection. For 72 hours, the world's most elite technical saboteurs from Unit 81 went to work. They did not damage the machines. On the contrary, they made them better, but with a lethal hidden purpose. They disassembled the control modules of the monitoring stations and replaced standard microchips with poisoned versions that were indistinguishable from the originals under a microscope. These new chips contained a hidden wireless communication layer, allowing them to broadcast and receive data via a secure, low-frequency satellite link that bypassed the hospital's internal firewalls. Furthermore, the software governing the anesthesia delivery system was subtly modified. The Mossad's coders introduced a zero-day vulnerability that allowed remote operators to override the manual safety limits of gas concentrations. This was done with such precision that even if a doctor in the room looked at the digital display, the screen would continue to show normal levels while the machine was actually delivering a lethal or incapacitating mixture. To ensure total invisibility, the agents installed miniature fiber optic cameras inside the surgical lighting rigs. These cameras were no larger than a grain of rice, designed to provide the control center in Tel Aviv with a high-definition, bird's-eye view of every movement the surgeon made. By the time the crates were resealed with counterfeit factory holograms and loaded onto a cargo ship bound for Hamad Port in Doha, the trap was set. The Mossad had not only infiltrated the hospital, they had effectively become its technical nervous system. Every wire, every sensor, and every pixel on the surgical monitors was now an extension of Israeli intelligence. Back in the Negev, in the simulated hospital room, Mossad's medical consultants practiced the execution for weeks. They studied Al-Mansour's medical records until they knew his heart's rhythm better than his own doctors. They calculated the exact milligram of medication and the precise percentage of oxygen reduction needed to induce a cardiac arrest that would look like a natural failure under the stress of surgery. The ghost in the machine was ready, and as the equipment was installed in the Al-Zubarah suite, Khalid Al-Mansour was unknowingly signing his own death warrant by simply agreeing to be saved. While the technical sabotage of the medical equipment provided the Mossad with a digital scalpel, the operation still required eyes and ears on the ground. Human assets capable of navigating the high-security environment of the Al-Zubarah Medical Suite without triggering a single alarm. This stage of the mission involved the deployment of combatants from the Caesarea unit, the most elite and secretive branch of the Mossad responsible for deep-cover operations in hostile or neutral territories. For this mission, 2 agents were selected, a man and a woman who would pose as senior technical specialists from the Luxembourg front company, LuxMed Systems. Their legends, the elaborate backstories and identities created for them, were flawless. They weren't just given fake passports, they were given lives. They had digital footprints, social media histories, and professional references that stretched back a decade in the European medical technology sector. The training for these 2 agents was grueling and atypical. For 6 months, they lived in a simulated environment in Israel that mirrored the exact layout and atmospheric conditions of the Doha clinic. They didn't just practice surveillance. They became certified experts in the specific robotic surgical systems they had sabotaged. They spent thousands of hours disassembling and reassembling the very machines that were now sitting in the port of Doha. The Mossad knew that if a Qatari security officer or a skeptical hospital administrator asked a technical question, the agent's response had to be instinctive, professional, and devoid of any hesitation that might suggest they were anything other than bored European engineers. They learned the specific jargon of German medical manufacturing, the nuances of Luxembourgish business etiquette, and even the minor complaints about European bureaucracy that would make their identities feel lived in and authentic. The arrival in Doha was a masterclass in psychological tension. In late 2021, as the desert heat began to settle over the Qatari capital, the 2 agents touched down at Hamad International Airport. They traveled on genuine European service passports, carrying specialized diagnostic tools that had been carefully cleansed of any Israeli origin. As they stood at the immigration counter, surrounded by the high-tech facial recognition systems of one of the world's most monitored airports, the agents maintained a posture of professional exhaustion, the look of 2 specialists who had spent too many hours on long-haul flights. They were cleared within minutes. The Qatari intelligence service, while highly capable, saw exactly what the Mossad wanted them to see. 2 high-paid contractors coming to install expensive equipment for a VIP patient whose identity was supposedly a state secret. Once inside the Al-Zubarah clinic, the infiltration entered its most dangerous phase. The hospital was a fortress of glass and steel, crawling with Al-Mansour's personal security detail. Men who were trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and who looked at every newcomer with a cold, murderous suspicion. These guards weren't just looking for weapons. They were looking for anomalies, for people who didn't fit the rhythm of the hospital. The Mossad agents had to perform their duties under the constant, unblinking gaze of these protectors. They spent days in the operating theater, calibrating the robotic arms and setting up the monitoring stations, all while Al-Mansour's bodyguards stood in the corners of the room, their hands never far from their concealed sidearms. Every movement was a gamble. While pretending to check the wiring of the surgical lights, the agents were actually ensuring that the hidden fiber optic cameras were transmitting a clear signal to the Mossad's offshore command center. While testing the backup power systems, they were verifying that the remote access backdoor in the anesthesia software was fully operational and undetected by the hospital's internal IT department. The psychological pressure was immense. They were working centimeters away from the very men who would kill them instantly if their true identities were revealed. Yet, they stayed in character, complaining about the hospital's Wi-Fi speed and discussing the dinner reservations they had made at a luxury restaurant in the Pearl Qatar. They were ghosts hiding in plain sight, weaving the final strands of a web that was about to tighten around Khalid Al-Mansour's failing heart. The target had arrived in Doha, settled into his palatial suite, and felt a false sense of total security, unaware that the technical staff he had walked past in the hallway were the architects of his approaching end. The morning of the surgery in Doha arrived with a heavy, uncharacteristic mist rolling off the Persian Gulf, a fitting atmospheric shroud for the invisible war about to unfold within the walls of the Al-Zubarah clinic. Khalid Al-Mansour was moved to the surgical suite under a security protocol that would have been more appropriate for the transport of a nuclear warhead. His personal bodyguards, men with eyes like flint and hands that never strayed far from their concealed weapons, occupied the corridors and the sterile anterooms, scanning every nurse and orderly with a predatory intensity. They believed they had secured the perimeter. They had swept the room for microphones, checked the oxygen tanks for tampering, and even tasted the preoperative fluids. But they were looking for an enemy from the 20th century. They were entirely unprepared for a ghost living inside the binary code of their own life support systems. If you are a student of high-stakes intelligence and the silent wars that shape our global reality, you are in the right place. Before we enter the heart of the operating room, ensure you are subscribed to this channel. Join our elite archive of declassified narratives and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive investigation into the shadows of the Mossad. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the surgical team, led by a world-renowned Swiss cardiothoracic specialist who had no idea he was a pawn in a geopolitical endgame, began the procedure. As the robotic arms, calibrated just days prior by the Mossad agents, pierced the skin of Al-Mansour's chest, a different kind of surgery was beginning 1,000 miles away. In a windowless room in Tel Aviv, and mirrored on a luxury yacht anchored in international waters, the tactical medical cell of the Mossad took control. They weren't just watching. They were the secondary pilots of the entire medical infrastructure. Through the fiber optic cameras hidden in the surgical lights, they had a crystal-clear 8K resolution view of the open heart. They could see every suture, every drop of blood, and the precise movement of the valve replacement. The execution was designed to be a zero-trace event. The Mossad doctors knew that a sudden cardiac arrest would be suspicious, even in a high-risk surgery. They needed the death to be the logical conclusion of a failing body. This required a level of biotechnical syncing that had never been attempted in the field. Using the backdoor in the anesthesia software, the remote operators began to subtly manipulate the oxygen saturation levels. They didn't cut the air, they reduced it by a mere 3% every 10 minutes, a shift so slight that the primary anesthesiologist's monitors, already fed falsified data by the Mossad's poison chips, showed a perfectly stable patient. While the Swiss surgeon worked on the valve, the Mossad's digital injectants began to alter the rhythm of the heart. By sending micropulses of electrical interference through the monitoring leads, they induced a state of silent ischemia. To the medical team in the room, it appeared as though Al-Mansour's heart was simply too weak to sustain the bypass. The bip of the monitor began to stutter. In the control room, the Mossad agents watched the real-time data. The target's brain was being slowly starved of oxygen, cell by cell, in a process that looked, smelled, and felt like a tragic but natural complication of surgery. The complexity of this infiltration is a testament to the lengths intelligence agencies will go to reach the unreachable. If you value this level of technical detail and investigative storytelling, consider supporting our work by liking this video and sharing it with those who appreciate the true mechanics of espionage. Your engagement is what allows us to continue declassifying these shadows. At the critical juncture of the operation, the Mossad triggered the final sequence. They overrode the infusion pump, delivering a concentrated dose of a potassium-based solution that mimicked the body's own chemical response to extreme cardiac stress. The heart of Khalid Al-Mansour, the man who had orchestrated the deaths of thousands, gave its final, erratic throb and then went still. The room erupted into a controlled panic. The Swiss surgeon called for the defibrillator, but the Mossad had already ensured that the energy discharge would be slightly out of phase with the heart's natural electrical window, rendering the resuscitation attempts useless. After 45 minutes of desperate, genuine effort by the unwitting medical staff, the time of death was called. The guards in the hallway, men who would have died for Al-Mansour, stood frozen as the lead surgeon emerged, his gown stained with the blood of a man he couldn't save. There was no one to shoot. There was no assassin to chase. There was only the cold, sterile reality of a failed heart. While the security detail began the frantic process of notifying their handlers in Tehran, the two European technicians from LuxMed Systems were already quietly packing their diagnostic kits. They expressed their professional regret to the hospital staff, signed the final maintenance logs, and walked out of the front doors of the Al-Zubarah clinic. They didn't run. They walked with the calm, measured pace of people who had a dinner reservation to catch. The diagnostic was final. The architect of shadows was gone, and the clinic that was supposed to be his fortress had become his tomb, orchestrated by a ghost in the machine that no one would ever find. The death of Khalid Al-Mansour was not the end of Operation Clinical Shadow. It was merely the beginning of its most dangerous phase, the extraction and the total erasure of the Mossad's presence in Qatar. As the sirens of the Qatari security forces began to wail in the distance, and the hospital was placed under a total lockdown, the two agents from the Caesarea unit were already executing their Phase Zero departure. They did not head for their hotel, nor did they attempt to reach the airport, which they knew would be the first point of closure for the Qatari State Security Bureau. Instead, they navigated through the service corridors of the Al-Zubarah complex, utilizing pre-placed electronic keycards that bypassed the building's biometric locks. Their escape route was a masterpiece of urban invisibility. They reached an underground parking level where a nondescript SUV, rented weeks earlier by a different front company, was waiting. Inside the vehicle, they changed their appearances in seconds, discarding their professional European attire for the casual clothing of high-end tourists. They drove toward the Luxembourg district, not to hide, but to blend into the city's vibrant, chaotic nightlife. While the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's local cell was frantically auditing the hospital's guest logs and security footage, the Mossad cyber division back in Tel Aviv was remotely purging every byte of data from the hospital servers. The poisoned chips in the medical equipment were triggered to self-destruct their firmware, leaving nothing behind but fried silicon that would look like a simple electrical surge to any forensic investigator. The stories we declassify on this channel are designed to show you the reality behind the headlines. If you find this level of investigation valuable, please leave a comment below telling us which intelligence agency's operation you want to see next. Your feedback directly shapes our future declassified reports. Subscribe now to stay at the cutting edge of shadow history. The extraction from the country itself was equally ingenious. Rather than risking a commercial flight, the agents utilized the maritime bridge. A private luxury yacht, flying the flag of a neutral European nation, was waiting 3 miles off the coast of the Pearl Qatar. The agents utilized a small, high-speed tactical boat launched from a private villa they had leased under another alias. By the time the Qatari authorities realized that the European technicians were missing, the yacht was already in international waters, heading toward the coast of Oman where a safe house and a private extraction flight were waiting. The agents vanished as if they had never existed, leaving behind a dead high-value target and a medical facility that had no idea it had been the staging ground for a world-changing assassination. The geopolitical aftermath of Al-Mansour's death sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Tehran, Beirut, and Gaza. The immediate impact was the total paralysis of a multi-billion-dollar arms procurement network. Without Al-Mansour's unique expertise and his web of personal contacts, dozens of shipments of missile components were seized, lost, or frozen in ports across the globe. But the deeper damage was psychological. A profound sense of dread settled over every high-ranking official who relied on Western technology or medical care. The realization that their own heart monitors or surgical robots could be turned into executioners created a climate of extreme paranoia. The trust gap in global medical logistics widened overnight. In the final analysis, Operation Clinical Shadow remains a landmark in the evolution of modern warfare. It proved that in an era of total connectivity, the most dangerous weapon is not the one that explodes, but the one that functions exactly as intended, until the precise millisecond it is told to do otherwise. The Mossad didn't just kill an enemy. They proved that the sanctuary of the modern world is an illusion. As we close this file, remember that for every headline you read, there are 1,000 stories that will never be told. silent operations conducted in the sterile white halls of hospitals and the dark corridors of the internet. Khalid Al-Mansour lived his life in the shadows, and in the end, it was the shadows that claimed him, leaving the world a slightly different place, one heartbeat at a time. This has been a declassified investigation into the trap that no one saw coming in a city of glass and sand. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this deep dive. This operation is a stark reminder that the world of intelligence is far more complex than any fiction. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and share this video with those who seek the truth beneath the surface of global events. We will see you in the next shadow.